It so quickly got so silent. I'm sorry to interrupt. It sounds like you were having a great conversation, and we always want to give you the chance to interact with each other, to spend some time talking at the beginning of our talks every Monday. Sorry about that, but feel free to talk again after. Meanwhile, welcome to the second installment in our fall 2018 Colloquium on Law and the Production of Inequality. Some of you who were here last time know we had Dan Danielson, a professor of law, to talk about trade, distribution and development in global supply chains. And we have a number of really interesting speakers coming next. Michael Albertus of the University of Chicago will come to talk about inequality, constitutionalism, and the elite origins of democracy. We have Professor Tommaso Ferrando coming to talk about law and the reproduction of food poverty and the criminalization of hunger and various other, I think, really interesting things, which you might be interested in as well. And then we will end the semester in late November with a talk on feminist approaches to the regulation of sex work and transnational governance and feminist lawmaking with another professor, Hila Shamir, who I think will also be super interesting. So thank you for coming today. Keep our events in mind for the next time. And today, we're very pleased to welcome Ignacio Saiz. He is the executive director of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, a role to which he was appointed in 2009. He was director of policy at the International Secretariat of Amnesty International, where his responsibilities included overseeing many of Amnesty's new initiatives, research, campaigning, and advocacy on economic, social, and cultural rights among them. He has also worked as a freelance human rights consultant for several other organizations in areas relating to sexuality and human rights, the prevention of torture, post-conflict accountability. He has an LLM in international human rights law with distinction from the University of Essex. And we always try in these events, he will be speaking on using an economic and social rights approach to tackle economic inequality. His talk is entitled From Disparity to Dignity, Tackling Economic Inequality Through Human Rights, which is also the title of a report produced by the Center for Economic and Social Rights. And I think it's going to be a great talk from what we've seen already. Responding to the talk, we always try, because this is an interdisciplinary center, we always try to bring in somebody from a different perspective. So we've asked Erin Lentz, and she's very kindly agreed. Erin is an assistant professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT. She teaches on research and empirical methods, development policy, social policy. Her research explores food security, gender, nutrition, and agricultural linkages, and U.S. food aid and food assistance policies. She has three really interesting research agendas going on right now. She's developing with collaborators the Women's Empowerment in Nutrition Index, looking at U.S. and international food aid and food assistance policies, and looking at innovative measures to combat food insecurity in Southern Africa. She has also done research in Bangladesh on the secondary effects of food aid. She has worked or consulted with CARE, the UN's World Food Program, and numerous other international NGOs on markets, food security, and food assistance programs. And she works here in Austin on the City of Austin Travis County Food Policy Board. So it's always nice when you bring some of your work home to do here. She is a PhD in sociology, and will be responding after Ignacio finishes. So please join me in welcoming Ignacio to.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be invited. While the issue of economic inequality has risen in recent years to the top of the political agenda, there are still very few academic institutions, or for that matter, human rights NGOs, that are paying serious attention to the human rights dimensions of the issue. So I want to pay tribute to the University of Austin and to the Rapoport Center for the dedicated way in which it's interrogating and elucidating the links between economic inequality and human rights under Professor Brinks's leadership. Your line of inquiry here has a great affinity with the work of the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which, by the way, is an international NGO working to advance human rights through economic and social policy, and to challenge the policy failures that fuel deprivations of social and economic rights. As an organization set up 25 years ago to defend these rights, still very much the neglected half of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we at the center see the alarming concentration of wealth over this same period of 25 years, where 82% of the wealth generated last year went to the richest 1% of the global population. We see this as one of the most pressing concerns for the human rights community at this moment in history. So in this lecture, I hope to explain why I think this is the case, and what we as human rights practitioners can do about it. I will argue that the human rights movement has a great deal to offer the struggle being waged by many other actors for a more economically egalitarian society, but I will also concede that we have some conceptual, normative, and strategic challenges to confront if we are to effectively harness the redistributive potential of human rights. So I'll begin by sharing how we at the center understand the relationship between economic inequality and human rights as the conceptual basis for our concern about it. And I'll then speak to what we see as the normative foundations for this work and to the progress that's being made both in developing and deploying the applicable framework of human rights law. Thirdly, I'll address some of the strategic opportunities and challenges of bringing human rights principles and mechanisms to bear on questions of economic inequality, and I'll be drawing there on examples and insights from CSR's recent work, and that includes our efforts to challenge inequality-inducing austerity measures, fiscal austerity measures, in countries ranging from Spain to South Africa, and secondly, the scope for advancing a rights-based agenda against inequality through the Global Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed 3 years ago. And I'll conclude with some final thoughts on the added value of human rights to this area. So, conceptualizing economic inequality as a human rights concern. How should we conceptualize economic inequality as a human rights concern? So the publication of Samuel Moyn's book, Not Enough, earlier this year, many of you may have seen, if not read it, which was preceded by several articles on the same topic by Samuel Moyn. This sparked a major debate in human rights academic and practitioner circles around the extent to which the human rights framework can serve to challenge economic inequality. At the center of this debate was Moyn's very provocative thought experiment about Croesus's world. Can I ask how many of you have read or seen or heard of that? Okay, more than a handful. So, to those who haven't, Moyn imagines a hypothetical scenario where one man, who he calls Croesus, owns all the wealth, but he rules benevolently over a population which enjoys just a sufficient floor of social and economic rights guarantees to avoid destitution. And he uses this hypothetical scenario to argue that a situation of profound inequality under the Gini coefficient, if those who are familiar with the Gini coefficient, this would be the highest possible score of 1, total equality, where one person owns as much as everybody else. He uses it to argue how the most profound situation of inequality can coexist with full respect for human rights law, Moyn claims. And he says that therefore, if this absurd situation is compliant with human rights law, that this is an indictment of the human rights framework, that the absence of any concern, his words, the absence of any concern for socioeconomic inequality in the Universal Declaration and the treaties that flow from it has rendered the human rights movement, at best, a passive bystander to neoliberalism, and at worst, an active accomplice of neoliberalism. This is his claim. So let me first say that I firmly agree with Moyne's analysis that the human rights movement has been woefully neglectful of issues of economic inequality. And indeed, large parts of the human rights movement still continue to give privileged or even exclusive attention to civil and political rights at the expense of economic, social, and cultural rights. Moyne's work is a powerful challenge to those of us who do work on economic, social, and cultural rights to re-examine the effectiveness of our work in dealing with structural injustices and asymmetries of power. But I fundamentally disagree with Moyne on the two basic conclusions that he draws. First of all, that perfect inequality has no human rights implications, and secondly, that human rights has nothing to say on economic inequality, and moreover is ill-equipped to challenge it. Why do I say that? Well, Croesus's world can really only exist in the world of myth. It's not just an implausible scenario, it's an impossible one. Keeping people just above the level of destitution, that's antithetical to the fundamental duty of states under human rights law to progressively achieve the full realization of economic, social, and cultural rights for all, using the maximum available resources at their disposal. Moreover, even from a civil and political rights lens, such an extreme concentration of wealth and power would surely thwart any meaningful exercise of rights of democratic participation by Croesus's citizens. Or actually, are they slaves rather than citizens? So at CSR, at the center, our starting point is not a hypothetical one, but one based on the empirical evidence of how human rights fare in real-life contexts of extreme inequality. Well, in practice, extreme inequality is inextricably linked to widespread deprivations of human rights. Indeed, at the center, we contend that extreme inequality should be understood as both cause and consequence of human rights violations. Now, I concede that establishing causal links and effects when dealing with such complex, multifactorial phenomena as inequality, that's an invidious task. But there is ample evidence to suggest or to assert that the extreme concentration of wealth has seriously detrimental effects on the whole range of human rights. Most obviously, income and wealth inequalities translate directly into disparities in access to goods and services that people need to realize their economic, social, and cultural rights: affordable healthcare, quality education, adequate housing, etc. Let me give an example of one of the world's most unequal countries, South Africa, where the wealthiest 1% owns half of all assets in the country, and the top decile, the top 10%, holds 95% of the country's wealth. In that scenario, access to quality health services and schooling remain the privilege of the upper and middle classes, with poor and working class households restricted to woefully underfunded and highly inadequate systems of public health care and education. And there's more information on that in work that we've just done on inequality and human rights in South Africa. And our work in South Africa has also shown a striking but intuitive correlation between economic disparities on the one hand and racial and gender disparities on the other, with poverty rates for black South African women being 50% higher than for white men in South Africa. And that just illustrates how everywhere vertical and horizontal inequalities, in other words, inequalities of wealth and income, and horizontal inequalities between population groups, they're deeply interrelated, and they're compounded by discrimination on grounds such as race and gender. But extreme inequality also hampers the enjoyment of civil and political rights in a range of ways. For example, distorting people's access to justice or to political participation, and also driving insecurity and conflict. Perhaps more indirectly, extreme inequality also fosters and perpetuates the political capture of institutions by economic elites. And that corrodes democracy and breeds disaffection with it, as Oxfam's work has shown. And we're seeing right now from Brazil to the US, a sense of disenfranchisement and exclusion from the socioeconomic benefits of globalization has been cynically manipulated by right-wing authoritarian populists whose agendas are not only repressive of civil liberties, but paradoxically they are profoundly elitist, serving to perpetuate economic inequality even further. And finally, in terms of broader economic impacts that economic inequality has, there's also an increasing recognition that extreme inequality can hinder economic growth, which is relevant to human rights because growth is a powerful determinant of states' capacities to progressively realize economic, social, and cultural rights. And economic inequality has also in many studies been shown to thwart social mobility, to contribute to financial instability and financial crisis. So that, in terms of teasing out how economic inequality can be seen as a cause of human rights deprivations. But for me, an equally important aspect of the nexus between economic inequality and human rights is that economic inequality is in many ways a consequence of human rights violation, not just a cause, it's a consequence. Why do I say that? Because many of the key determinants of economic inequality are the product of deliberate policy choices which are in breach of governments' human rights obligations. Let me give examples. What are these policy determinants of economic inequality? Well, regressive and discriminatory fiscal policies, tax and budget policies, the erosion of workers' rights and wage guarantees, the absence of effective social protection mechanisms, barriers that people face in access to health or education, or the unequal burden of unpaid care work that is borne by women. These are just some of the key factors, the most significant factors in the escalation of economic inequality. And there's quite broad agreement that these are amongst the key policy determinants of inequality. Now, each of those examples that I just mentioned, all can be framed as denials of specific provisions of international human rights standards. So extreme economic inequality is not just an instrumental concern because it might be conducive to human rights violations. It's actually an inherent injustice because it derives from a web of policies and practices that violate human rights. This brings us to the question of the normative foundations for addressing economic inequality. So, back to Moyne. Moyne argues that the international human rights framework is irrelevant to the challenges of inequality because it basically says nothing about what level of economic inequality is compatible with the realization of human rights. And he says economic and social rights provisions, which you might think would be relevant to economic inequality, are concerned, according to him, only with a minimum level of sufficiency. Well, I believe that this overlooks the radically redistributive potential of human rights norms, and in particular norms on economic, social, and cultural rights. While it's true that international human rights standards don't explicitly refer to economic inequality, they contain a wealth of provisions regarding the specific redistributive policy interventions that most directly produce inequality or contain it. Many of the most critical pre-distributive and redistributive policies for reducing inequality, from labor market regulations to fiscal policy, from access to health and education to social protection, they're all governed by human rights principles and standards. A very obvious example is labor rights standards. The erosion of real minimum wages has been an important factor contributing to the 70% increase in the income gap between the top and bottom 10% 10% of wage earners over the past 2 decades. And there's an IMF study that says that shows how the drop in unionization rates over the past 3 decades is associated with an increase in top income shares. That's in advanced economies. So examples of how the erosion of workers' rights directly contributes to economic inequality. Therefore, the protection of core labor rights, including rights to freedom of association, collective bargaining, the right to decent work, and fair conditions of remuneration, are key interventions for stemming the growth of economic inequality. Labor rights standards, such as the ILO conventions, are among the most long-established branches of international human rights law, predating the Universal Declaration in some cases. And though these labor rights are under political attack, they have long played and continue to play a fundamental role in constraining inequality. And I mention this because often the debate on the relationship between human rights and inequality assumes that human rights have never engaged with inequality. But look at labor rights. I mean, where would we be now in terms of inequality would be even worse were it not for some basic human rights gains that have been made on issues from access to education to labor rights. You see my point? So human rights is already constraining economic inequality in ways that we often are so normalized and taken for granted that we don't see them. In other cases, the application of norms, the interpretation of norms that are applicable to some of these specific policy determinants of inequality, they're still evolving. And an example here is the right to social security. This right has enormous implications for current efforts right now to secure universal commitments to social protection floors. And these social protection is proven to be a key policy in mitigating and redressing both economic inequality but also social inequalities. So contrary to Moyne's critique that economic and social rights is a minimalist approach, there's nothing minimalist about a human rights approach to social protection. Indeed, the added value of bringing a human rights approach to advocacy around redistributive policies is very often that it raises the level of ambition in comparison to conventional approaches. Social protection is a good case in point. Traditional approaches to social protection, say by the World Bank or the IMF, have generally, you could describe them as palliative. You know, they're kind of give the crumbs to the poor, social safety net provisions aimed at really sort of mitigating the worst effects, the worst ravages of the prevailing neoliberal economic model through what some people have termed social bribery. Human rights interventions, by contrast, such as, for example, those proposed by the former Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Extreme Poverty, Magdalena Sepúlveda, human rights interventions on social protection insist that social protection programs should be universal, not just targeted. They should be universal, they should be comprehensive, they should be integrated, they should be holistic, with an explicitly redistributive and egalitarian ambition. And they should be alert to the gender and other power dynamics that can often be reinforced inadvertently by social protection measures. But probably the single most important tool, policy tool, that governments have both to resource rights and also to reduce inequality is fiscal policy, tax and budget policy, how governments generate revenue and how they allocate expenditure. And here, a cornerstone norm, human rights norm, of relevance to fiscal policy is Article 2 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Probably the most redistributive, the most explicitly redistributive provision of international human rights law. Article 2 obliges states to devote the maximum available resources to progressively ensure the full realization of these rights without discrimination or retrogression. Retrogression meaning backsliding. Am I losing people here, or we're still okay with? I mean, the economic and social rights are an amazing tools. It's just a terrible language. I mean, you would never put these things on a banner in a demonstration, right? What do we want? Progressive realization according to maximum available resources. When do we want it? Now. It just doesn't work. But anyway, so forgive the language. Whenever I utter these words, I think I'm knocking people to sleep. But you're studying human rights, so you have to deal with this. So where was I? I was on maximum available resources. I should also say that's the key provision, Article 2 of the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But it's also worth noting that the core treaties on gender discrimination, race discrimination, and some others, the CRC, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, they also require states to redistribute resources in order to ensure substantive equality, including substantive equality in the socio-economic sphere. So I mentioned that's another redistributive set of provisions. Nevertheless, the treaty monitoring bodies, the UN bodies that oversee these norms or oversee compliance, they've generally been reluctant to operationalize the concept of maximum available resources for reasons that vary, but they range from the classic deference to the executive, on budgetary matters. No, we can't interfere with how states, make budgetary choices, to lack of technical familiarity with rights-based tools of budget analysis. Like, they want to engage with the concept, but are not really sure how. This is changing, and I can say a bit more later or in the discussion about how. But just to say that a key element of our strategy for addressing economic inequality has therefore been to encourage greater human rights scrutiny of the inequitable tax and budget policies that are fueling inequality. And how do we do this? By bringing compelling evidence, well put together evidence before these bodies, before treaty bodies, before courts, before parliamentary human rights committees, showing how these principles are violated in practice. So you're afraid to engage with maximum available resources? Here's a case study on on non-retrogression or on the violation of the principle. And we've done this in a number of contexts. And I want to speak a little bit, and this takes me now a bit more to the question of strategy. How it's all well and good to have the conceptual and normative foundations, but what actually can human rights do about inequality? And this, I want to give the work that we've been doing on fiscal austerity as an example of what human rights can do. So we have focused on fiscal austerity as one of the most significant global policy trends driving economic inequality across the globe in the 10 years since the global financial crisis. I mean, these are policies that commonly entail drastic cuts in social spending, often accompanied by regressive tax reforms, cuts in pensions and other social protection programs, as well as public sector wage restrictions and weakening of labor regulations. This is the classic austerity package. Now, austerity is not just Greece or Spain, as is often thought. Austerity is a global phenomenon. Right now, this year, more than 2/3 of the world's countries are implementing some form or other, some combination or other of the austerity measures that I just described. To give you an example of austerity on steroids, at the end of 2016, Brazil passed a constitutional amendment freezing all public spending for the next 20 years. How do you like that? Compliant with human rights? I don't think so. Now, so austerity is a global phenomenon. It's sweeping Latin America. Argentina is in the grip of austerity as we speak. South Africa too. And our work has shown in countries across the globe that these austerity measures often have profound effects on economic and social inequalities and profoundly discriminatory impacts on women, on older persons, children, young people, persons with disabilities, migrants, racialized groups, in situation after situation where we've analyzed austerity. And our work has also shown that austerity very often is unnecessary, as in most cases there are more equitable alternatives which are not being considered. And these policies are being pushed quite dogmatically by certain key international financial institutions, the IMF above all, despite the evidence, including evidence by the IMF's own policy researchers, that austerity doesn't even work according to its own economic rationale. It's not even good for growth. So I see that I wanted to illustrate our work in this area, or give our work in this area as a concrete illustration for strategies for using human rights to challenge inequality-inducing policies. Now, our work here began in my country of nationality, in Spain. We used to have an office in Spain, and this was just about the time that we were starting to really interrogate fiscal policy from a human rights perspective. We had this case study unfolding around us. It was it was 2011, the year of Occupy here. I think the year that the Occupy movement started. Well, we had an Occupy movement first in Spain. It was called does anyone know what they were called? Indignados. Thank you. Who said that? Muy bien. The Indignados y Indignadas, I guess, to be non-gender specific. The Indignados, the indignant, was Spain's Occupy movement. And it was motivated by austerity. It was a protest against austerity. Spain implemented quite drastic austerity measures in 2010. So in 2011, there was, we were all out in the streets, in the squares. We were all doing this, thinking, doesn't this look silly? But it feels great, And meanwhile, me and my colleagues were upstairs, kind of, policy wonking on on human rights and fiscal policy. And we said, we've got to connect this work to what's happening out in the streets, and it was interesting to see. This is a side; it's not in my speech. Interesting to see how the discourses connect. The sort of professionalized language of human rights, kind of descending into the streets and engaging with people's kind of own concepts of what rights and justice are in an austerity context. For me personally, that was one of the most amazing things about that moment. Anyway, I'm digressing a lot, and at this rate, I won't cover everything I want to cover. So, what did we do about it? The Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the treaty body that monitors the covenant that I mentioned before, was coincidentally reviewing Spain in 2012. So we mobilized, we called together a whole range of groups of Spanish civil society, from feminist groups to people with disability, groups working on disability, to Gitano, the Roma community organizations, LGBT groups, anti-poverty groups, development organizations, a real broad swathe. And we said, listen, there's this thing called the Committee in Geneva, and some of them had heard of it, and others said, what? Geneva? Where's that? And we explained, look, the government just isn't listening. There was a conservative government at the time that really was not even opening channels for deliberation or dialogue on the rightness or wrongness of austerity measures. And so all of these groups were up for trying whatever they could. And they saw the possibility of putting together a shadow report on austerity that documented why Spain's austerity measures were retrogressive. They were a violation of the non-retrogression principle. So we looked at case law on non-retrogression in countries from Colombia to, can't remember where else, probably South Africa. And we said, look, this is how you piece together an argument of non-retrogression. This is the statistical evidence you need. This is how we can present it compellingly in a fact sheet. This is how we show that there are alternatives. For example, showing there are alternatives, we had this nice pie chart, not pie chart, a sort of concentric circle chart that showed this is how much was cut in the budget for 2010 or 2011, I think it was, proposed for 2011. And this is how much, a bigger circle, that could have been recouped for the public coffers had very, very modest steps been taken to clamp down on tax evasion. Just a 5% reduction in the estimated amount going to tax evasion. And we had this, an authoritative figure from the Union of Treasury Workers. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of arguments and the kinds of data that we needed to make a compelling case. So compelling was our case that the committee just basically, for the first time, said, we feel confident pronouncing that these measures in Spain are retrogressive. And the committee made recommendations not just to Spain, but very unusually, it issued a letter to all states party to the covenant saying, those of you who are considering fiscal consolidation, otherwise known as austerity, you should bear in mind you have human rights principles to take into account. And they issued a set of criteria that these measures should be temporary, should be strictly necessary, should be proportionate to the aim sought. You know, a number of kind of classic human rights considerations, but they also introduce concepts like, you know, you should consider less harmful fiscal measures, including progressive tax reforms. And these criteria have now been repeated by the committee in its work, in its recommendations to a number of other countries. In Spain, what impact did it have? Well, at the time, very little, because the government just said, we don't listen to human rights expert bodies in Geneva. We're just listening to Brussels and Germany and Berlin. You know, we're listening to the really powerful players. But then earlier this year, Spain appeared again before the committee, because, you know, these things are periodic. So Spain appeared again, and we made an even tougher argument and said, look, this is 4 years on, these are the further impacts of austerity, highlighting how Spain had become the second most unequal country in Europe in the 8 years since austerity. And we goaded and urged the committee to go even further in calling for a repeal of certain harmful measures. One of the measures that they echoed our recommendation, and they called for the repeal of the denial of healthcare to undocumented migrants, which Spain had argued was necessary for austerity reasons. There were the decline in the health budget, so we can't afford to give healthcare to undocumented migrants. They shouldn't be here in the first place, kind of thing. So the committee recommended, at our insistence, that be repealed. And there was a change of government in Spain, as some of you may know. And one of the first things that the new government did was repeal that legislation, citing its human rights obligations. And it explicitly linked its actions to the committee's recommendations. Now, impact of treaty bodies rarely come that direct, rarely that direct. But it's pretty notable, and I just want to underscore it for the modest but significant achievement that it is, and what you can do if you use human rights arguments in this kind of context. I'm aware that I probably need to wrap up soon. I've been going for a little while. But yeah. Now, I'm going to go to a strategic dilemma. I had other examples of use of treaty bodies that I can mention. We took Switzerland to task for its role as a tax haven before the Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. I want to tell you that story because it's quite very briefly. So again, this isn't about austerity, but this is about another key trend, which is the proliferation of tax abuse. And it's a huge human rights issue, because it's draining the capacity of states to deploy the maximum of their available resources, particularly low and middle income states. Switzerland was appearing before the CEDAW committee, and we said, let's get them on for being a tax haven. Switzerland is #1 on the Financial Secrecy Index published by the Tax Justice Network, so basically it's the biggest tax haven of all. And we said we compiled evidence again, but this time looking at extraterritorial obligations. Have I lost you on extraterritorial obligations? No, you're all completely comfortable with extraterritorial obligations. So we said, look, Switzerland's role as a tax haven is depriving countries like Zambia of the resources that Zambia needs to protect women's rights. So Switzerland's role as a tax haven is fueling inequality in Zambia. Now imagine the paper trail that you need to make that case. Because we're not letting Zambia off the hook. Of course, Zambia is the primary duty bearer for respecting women and fulfilling women's rights under its jurisdiction. But Switzerland also has concurrent responsibilities if it's allowing Swiss-registered companies to basically drain valuable resources from Zambia that Zambia could otherwise use for human rights purposes. And the committee, it's a funny story because the committee members, when we first went to them before the formal session, they said, "What?" They said, "But this is about Swiss women." They said, "This is about women in Switzerland." This is members of the committee. We said, "No, but the convention has, talks about states' extraterritorial obligations to at minimum, respect, protect, and help fulfill rights in other countries." We worked with them. We pieced together all the evidence, the arguments, extraterritorial obligations under economic and social rights norms. And we made them so comfortable, they got so comfortable and so fired up, and they said, "Yeah, this is a critical issue. Why didn't we do this before?" They cut and pasted the recommendation that we gave to them, and they gave it to Switzerland. And so Switzerland now has to undertake a human rights impact assessment of its financial secrecy laws, of its role as a tax haven, by the next time it comes before the CEDAW committee. And the CEDAW members are now, particularly some of them, are fired up on this issue. And they're asking all these tax haven countries, what about your extraterritorial obligations? So, is the world going to change because the treaty bodies are starting to do the right thing on fiscal austerity and on tax abuse? Well, probably not. Governments around the world are not going to quake in their boots because some committee in Geneva is going after them. And this brings me to the strategic dilemma that I wanted to bring to you, which is that we make no exaggerated claims about how powerful the human rights machinery can be. We know that on issues of economic policy, like I say, human rights monitoring bodies, particularly those outside the country the country in question, can only have, at best a sort of boomerang effect. Like I said, the Spain example, you rarely get hits that concrete. So what this has made us do is really take our human rights arguments outside the human rights sphere, right? So yes, we work primarily with human rights mechanisms at the national level, at the regional level, and at the global level, but human rights should also be human rights claims should also go to other forums and other sites of accountability and decision-making where decisions are taken on these issues, where fiscal policy is governed, where powerful institutions that can really clamp down on tax abuse. And that involves, that means places like the IMF. I mentioned before, the IMF is really pushing still fiscal austerity. The problem with taking human rights arguments to the IMF is that the IMF doesn't recognize any human rights responsibilities. It stubbornly resists recognizing that that it has a mandate on human rights. Recently, they've acknowledged that they have a mandate on inequality, on economic inequality in particular, and gender inequality, which they prefer to talk about women's empowerment rather than gender inequality. It's less scary. So we have used the language of gender equality, economic, and focused on the economic inequality impacts of austerity to get our foot in the door with the IMF. And we've had some success. Now, the IMF doesn't have shadow reporting, or it doesn't have, the kinds of forums and mechanisms and the treaty monitoring bodies that we're used to engaging around human rights. So you could argue, well, yes, that's a more powerful site for advocacy, but what are the means, what are the tools that we have to get human rights arguments across? So this is why I pose it as a strategic dilemma. For us, the answer to that strategic dilemma is both and. We have to obviously invoke and deploy the human rights machinery as best we can and push it to go further on these complex issues, but also we need to take human rights arguments and claims and evidence to other forums. And finally, the last kind of sphere I wanted to refer to was the development sphere. I mentioned that 3 years ago, the UN adopted, the international community adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, Agenda 2030. We engaged in this process, with this I'll finish, we engaged in this process very early on, before the agenda was adopted, because the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goals, really undercut human rights in quite significant ways, and we didn't want that to happen again. So we engaged really just as more as damage limitation than anything else, not because we thought that sustainable development agenda was going to change the world. And we actually got much more. When I say we, it's not just CSR, but the civil society networks that we were part of got much more out of that process than we hoped. A critical thing, and why I'm mentioning it here, is that the SDGs include a goal, a standalone goal, on reducing inequality within and between countries. Within countries and between countries. The rest of the SDGs cover poverty, maternal mortality, lots and lots of development issues. Frankly, there have been many, many commitments against poverty for decades. Going back 60 years, the international community is continually spouting commitments to reduce poverty, continually failing to meet them. This is the first time there has ever been an international consensus document committing to reduce inequality. And that's why I bring it up. For us, it's the most revolutionary thing about this agenda. Is it being honored in practice? Is it going to change the world? Well, it remains to be seen. 3 years on, there's very little evidence of any political will to act on goal 10, on that particular goal. It's a bit of an orphaned goal in the sense that all the other goals, most of them, have some kind of UN agency championing it. This one only has the World Bank. Well, and it doesn't really formally have any UN agency championing it, and the World Bank is kind of saying, let's use our concept of shared prosperity. And most civil society groups are saying, no. So it's a challenge to use the SDGs as a vehicle for advancing an agenda on accountability. I can talk more about that because I think Erin might also be addressing the issue of the SDGs. We have kind of 1 foot in and 1 foot out of that process. In other words, we believe it's important to constructively engage. Why? Because the development agenda has more traction in countries across the globe than the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights ever will in its dreams. That's a sad reality. So we have to be pragmatic about that. And so engage. That's why we engaged with Agenda 2030 to try and put human rights. There's an important cross-reference to human rights in the preamble of Agenda 2030, which actually is very good. It links to the full range of international human rights norms. And that was important. That cross-reference was an important foothold for us to use from here on. I can say more, but I don't want to tire you all out by speaking for longer. But my parting thought was really that, while the human rights movement is absolutely right, or while those of us in the human rights movement are absolutely right to question the contribution that we can meaningfully make to combating extreme inequality, we should also take note of what those actors are saying, those actors who are at the forefront of the struggle against inequality. What are they saying about the value added of human rights in this area? By they, I mean development organizations, social movements, ton of people that have come around something called the Fight Inequality Alliance. Maybe some of you have heard of it. We're part of that too. A coalition, a very broad global coalition of a vast array of different groups, all united by the concern for extreme inequality. And they say, of course there are variations and they don't speak as one group, but a common thing you hear is that human rights provides a universal language for articulating the shared conviction of all these different groups that extreme inequality is an affront to human dignity. And they also describe it, and many have see human rights potentially as a shared framework around which all these different actors can converge in the pursuit of what we all want, I think, which is redistributive justice. Thank you.
So thank you, Ignacio, for a really fascinating talk and very stimulating. And also thank you to Dan Brinkman and Sarah and Kate for having me. I'm excited to be here. So what I want to talk about a little bit today is thinking a bit about the SDGs, but also thinking about the relationship between social and economic inequality more, and how it relates to some of my own work around undernutrition in rural Bangladesh. But before I get there, I just want to make a comment about Ignacio's point that gender equality is a more sensitive word than talking about women's empowerment. I would also argue that women's empowerment and women's rights are more sensitive than saying human rights for women. So I was told recently by a congressional aide I could use human rights for women, but I could not use women's rights. So in some recent testimony I gave. So these things, it turns out language matters, and these things can be quite political. So I would encourage you all, if you haven't had a chance and you're interested in development, but also in the Sustainable Development Goals more broadly, the report that is on the CESR website is great. I highly recommend it. It's got a lot of really juicy details and some really good evidence about why inequality or economic inequality is so important when we're thinking about rights, and why rights are so important for thinking about inequality. So briefly, before I kind of dive into kind of extensions, I just wanted to point out a few things that I found really compelling that Ignacio had said. And I think this idea that extreme inequality is both a cause and consequence of human rights deprivations is, I think, very true. But I also think if we take that seriously, it has a huge number of implications for people like me as someone who does research on policy, but then also I think more broadly for folks who are thinking about development, folks who are thinking about economic policy, et cetera. And so I keep coming back to this idea of the relationship between rights and economic inequality is quite compelling. I also really appreciated this sense that, human rights potentially provide us with the possibility to think about radically redistributive policies. And that's something that's really tough in the current political climate in the US and elsewhere. Radical redistributive policies seem like a pretty far off and difficult thing to accomplish, but I think the more we really are willing to embrace a human rights-based set of agendas, the more reasonable it maybe would seem. I'm not quite sure how to get there, but it's something that I think is worth considering. And I would argue one of the ways in which we might be able to get there is through more and broader participation, right? And this also is perhaps not surprising when we think about human rights as possibly providing a framework for accountability, a framework for transparency. It's also a framework for participation. And so that's what I'm going to talk a little bit more about today. So in the paper From Dignity to Disparity, From Disparity to Dignity, much more important that way. It's not, we might feel like we're going in that direction, but let's try to go from disparity to dignity. I think something that really resonates with me is this call for an integrated approach, right? And I think this is one that I would echo. So integrated meaning thinking about how inequality in particular spheres might then bleed over into inequality in other spheres, how policy changes in one realm potentially have unintended consequences in others, or perhaps just overlooked consequences. And so I think it can be quite tempting as we think about the SDGs, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, and how they're operationalized, to think about sort of measurable outcomes, right? And this desire to have measurable outcomes to track progress. But sometimes, these measures are often quite political, right? And I think that CESR, you guys have some good examples of this kind of decision, for example, of the World Bank, among others, to use particular types of measures of reducing inequality. So avoiding using a Gini coefficient, because the Gini coefficient has implicit within it a broader suggestion of inequality than maybe the World Bank is willing to, recognize. And so if measures become political, and if we become too enamored of a measure, then we miss other inequalities that might matter, and we potentially misdiagnose the problem at hand. And so I think this is something that I see in my own work. And I would say that what was so exciting to hear is the way that all of these different civil society groups in Spain came together to craft a series to craft the case And sort of having multiple perspectives can really allow people to start demanding better, demanding their rights from hopefully the state, but also sometimes from beyond if necessary. And I would argue potentially from within their own homes, and so that's what I'll talk a little bit more about next. So thinking about this need for participation to identify inequalities and the drivers suggests there's a real link between economic and social inequalities that we need to pay attention to. So not just how economic inequalities relate to human rights, but how economic and social inequalities can kind of feed off one another. So much of my work is in what would be, I guess, the SDG 2 space, which is the zero hunger goal, or in the SDG 5 space, which is gender equality. So one of the ways that the SDG 2s is measured is the idea that you'll end stunting and wasting among children, adolescent girls, moms, and the elderly. And so one of the things that hopefully pops out is you're like, oh, well, that's a small group of the population, right? There's more people out there than just that, or just those folks. And those may be the folks who are most at risk. But are we missing something when we're not also trying to understand what's happening among adolescent boys, et cetera? And it turns out when we start thinking about, well, okay, these populations at risk, but the vast majority of data we have is really just on children under 5, right? And so even though we know that maybe adolescent girls are at risk and maybe adolescent boys are too, we don't really know. We don't really have any data to suggest that they are. And so there's been a decision to not measure these things, and so it's quite difficult for us to actually get a sense of what's going on. So what we do know then is we know a ton about undernutrition among children. Like, we know there are lots and lots of different factors. It's extremely complex, and some of these revolve around inequalities. Some of them revolve around just deprivations and et cetera. But we know a lot less about other household members, including adolescent girls, including moms, including the elderly. So what do we want to do about that? Well, I think that there's an opportunity to engage. So in the places that I work in low-income countries, there's a huge opportunity to engage in participation with community members themselves to identify the sorts of barriers that might exist within communities and within households that have to do with social and economic and cultural inequalities that result in some members of households being more at risk of being undernourished than others, right? And so to give you an example, my work in Bangladesh with my colleagues, also in my work in India with my colleagues, finds again and again that, oftentimes women are much more likely to absorb undernutrition. And these might not be moms, these are just women. And in fact, it's oftentimes younger women, relatively speaking, not older women. And so how do we then start thinking about within households, there are these inequalities that then contribute in some ways to further human rights deprivations, but also then to economic inequalities themselves. And so there's this cyclical effect that I think we need to attend to in ways oftentimes that can only be found when you're willing to have these sometimes very difficult discussions within households, with different members of households, and thinking beyond beyond kind of state level issues, or taking for granted, say, what the SDGs have identified as issues, right? And so I would argue the SDGs aren't necessarily measuring the sorts of challenges to undernutrition that maybe are most important. We just don't know, frankly. We're sort of operating off of a set of assumptions, and it's worth interrogating them. Furthermore, some of these inequalities with respect to health and nutrition and food intake are reflective not only of sort of inequalities within households, but also community norms and culture. And this becomes a very difficult thing for policymakers in particular to grapple with. Policymakers hate talking about culture. I think maybe you guys in the back have noticed it's a very challenging thing when we are asked to kind of conceptualize what does it mean when women in rural Bangladesh eat last and least and historically have. And how do we think about what that means for what sorts of foods are available that are last and oftentimes the leftovers. So for many women in Bangladesh, they say, yes, this is what I do. I have an interview with a woman who says, I'm a woman. It's okay for me to starve, right? Like, that's sort of the way things are. And at the same time, when people describe these sorts of kind of norms that are contributing to inequality, many women, in fact, suggest that they would prefer not to abide by them, but yet it's quite difficult to not, right? And so this kind of challenge around how do we provide support for women to make their own decisions around the sorts of food and nutrition that they want to eat? How do we, as people who are not of that community, then try to support their ability to have autonomy is quite a challenge for, I would say, for development people in general. Also, certainly, it's not clear to me that it's actually in the realm of most policymakers. And so what this means for me is that we then need to think about this, kind of going back to Ignacio's broader point of how are these things interconnected, right? And are there ways that we might be able to provide opportunities for women to have greater autonomy so that they can make choices whether or not they choose to eat last and least or not? And so one way to do that is to potentially start thinking about ways that involve women and others into kind of policy making themselves. So what are the sorts of things that they perceive would help them have these sorts of conversations that they might consider to be fraught within their homes? How might we end up trying to support that, and what are the sort of indirect effects that we might be able to do, or what are some of the indirect policies, such as enabling access to education, improving women's abilities to feel safe outside of the home, all of these sorts of things. How might that then enable women to kind of achieve the sorts of things that they themselves would like to achieve? And so I think this question around the role of participation and inequality becomes a really huge question that maybe has less to do directly with economic policy, because it's quite challenging to sort of think about how do we engage in changing economic policy. But I'd say that it's as important to try to have those discussions as it is to have conversations around the socio and cultural aspects of inequality. And so I think that, kind of coming back to Ignacio's point about palliative safety nets, I think sometimes it's quite tempting to think about, well, maybe if we just make sure this household has enough to eat, we don't have to worry about this anymore, right? And so I think a challenge with this is that first, it's not entirely clear, there's no way that policymakers or others have control over what goes on in a household. So directly kind of trying to address inequality within a home is fraught with challenges if you're trying to sort of just provide more resources. So that oftentimes is not effective. And so then we're sort of engaging in a longer term set of conversations around, well, what might it take for people to feel like they're in a safe enough space that they can demand their right to an equitable amount of food within their home? And I think that this, so to me, suggests that when we have an integrated approach and when we're sort of having a shift in kind of development thought to one that's addressing and alleviating inequalities, as opposed to one that's trying to sort of respond to, a sort of a perceived lack, right? And so if we're not thinking about the inequality piece, I think we run the real risk of not actually assisting people have a longer term achievable goal of being able to meet their human rights. And I think for me, this interplay between and across policy areas and innovative ways of engaging with participatory diagnoses of and responses to inequalities is a critical, I would say, a critical part of what development policy ought to be. And that's hard, and it takes a long time, and it's sometimes really slow, but I think it's sort of the direction that we need to go in. And I think that this foregrounding of inequality as it relates to rights becomes more and more important as we've seen that these more palliative efforts they're just not as effective as we all sort of had imagined they would be 40, 50, 60 years ago. So with that, I think I get to talk a lot more about this, but I think I get to open it up to questions. And I don't know if I get to be the question manager, but I would love to actually end on a question of how. So let me see this question of how do you think that that having human rights as a universal language can support sort of the adoption of policies that address inequalities, not just within countries who are potentially willing to hear that, but sort of more broadly beyond? Does that make sense? Like, how do we shift the debate? Does that?
Thanks, Erin. So that's a great question to start us off. I thought I would just say a couple of things about the process and how we do this. We have, you should get to go first and respond to anything you heard from Erin, and then we usually let the students have the first round of questions. Not all of you are part of the class, so you may or may not know that this is part of a semester-long seminar, and so we have some graduate students who have been engaging with the material, and they get their first round of questions. And then we open it up to everyone else. The only sort of procedural kind of requirements are, if you have a question, you should use a microphone, because we're recording the proceedings, and even though all of us here can hear you just fine, we lose the question on the recording if we don't have a microphone on it. And the other one is, if you have a follow-up question, raise 2 fingers, and we'll try to keep the conversation going on the same topic a little bit. All right, so, and Ignacio, if you would take the lectern again, that way we can get you on the mic as well.
When I talked about human rights potentially being this universal language that different groups can get around, I was really thinking of civil society groups. When you frame it, I don't know if you were framing it as governments or both. Well, I think one of the very significant things about the SDGs and SDG Goal 10 was precisely that. I mean, it was a real, in ways that you spoke about, it's a real shift in the paradigm. If you make development about inequality and not just about poverty, you're basically saying we are concerned about how society as a whole is structured, fairness in society as a whole. We're not just concerned about those that are getting left behind. I mean, those that are the worst off. That's a profound shift. And I think, in answer to your question, that we should note what that means, that the community of states agreed to that kind of language. Did they agree to it as rights? Goal 10 isn't framed explicitly in human rights terms, but as I said before, the agenda as a whole has very strong anchoring in human rights law and standards. I mean, explicitly, much more explicit language than we even hoped for. And so I think you can make the case that there is now a global recognition by the community of nations at the UN that reducing inequality within countries and between countries is a human rights obligation. It's a bit of an extrapolation, but you can make that case. And I want to stress also how significant it is that they agreed to reduce inequality between countries. I mean, that has always been, in the political forums of the UN, that's always been a very divisive issue. The G77 of the poor, basically low and middle income countries, have often said, we are poor because you're rich. There's been this kind of somewhat sterile debate around responsibilities around development, and the recognition, the consensus recognition that inequality between states is a development issue and a moral issue, effectively, I think is hugely groundbreaking. What does that mean for human rights? How can we frame that in human rights terms? So human rights norms and law generally are quite weak on the issue of inequality between countries. They don't have a great deal to say about perhaps the only instrument, the only piece of paper where that issue is addressed is the Declaration on the Right to Development, which it's a declaration rather than a binding treaty, so it has that weakness, shortcoming, but also it's very politically contested. And for many years, many people in the human rights community didn't even want to touch it because it was so toxic in terms of the debate, the tensions that it aroused at the UN. More recently, it's been kind of dusted off the shelf a little bit. Some very interesting work has been done on how the declaration can be operationalized. What does it mean in terms of tackling tax abuse, in terms of financial regulation? Some thoughtful work has been done around that. But it's still, and all this just to say that the question of inequalities between states is an issue that human rights needs to grapple with more effectively and needs to move beyond, I think, the Declaration on the Right to Development. The concept that I mentioned of extraterritorial obligations, you remember in the case of Switzerland, I was talking about that. That's, I think ETOs, extraterritorial obligations, are quite, I don't know if you would agree with this, quite legally well established, politically extremely contested. And I think we see our role at CSR as being provocateurs, pushing the language of extraterritorial obligations into these development spaces where they don't use human rights language all that often. And I think extraterritorial obligations are a way of getting of redressing inequalities between nations, and it's one of the next frontiers for human rights, I think.
You can just choose, just people will signal and you can manage the questions yourself.
Oh, I see. Yeah. I thought you meant I could just randomly fire a question at somebody. Hi.
Hi. I have a question about the kind of integrated approach that you talked about that we see as necessary for implementation of SDG 10. I know in the report it talks about a kind of bolstered support for the high-level political forum in providing accountability for states as they implement this goal. But on a more practical domestic level, how do you see some of these changes being implemented, especially since they require such broad fiscal reform, especially in countries like the US, for example, which kind of prides itself on its individualism and its commitment to neoliberal values? Where do you see this beginning, and who do you see taking charge on that?
Yeah. There's sort of a number of questions in in one there, but so the mechanisms for reviewing how the SDGs are implemented and progress are extremely important, and were an issue that civil society engaged very long and hard on. And the results are really not that great. I mean, at the global level, the high-level political forum is a bit of a joke, I have to say. Many of us pushed very hard. We said, look, why don't we look at the human rights mechanisms as an example, as a model? What about a UPR, the Universal Periodic Review? Why don't we have something like that? No. They didn't even want the language of accountability. That's why it's called follow-up and review, FUR, FUR. It's nice and furry and soft, But the language of accountability they didn't want to hear about. And these voluntary reviews, because they are voluntary, governments, states volunteer to have their record reviewed. They say whatever they like. There are no guidelines for how you should put these things together. It's not like human rights reporting, where at least there are guidelines and there's independent questioning or peer country questioning. Here, the last high-level political forum, I'm digressing a little bit, but on the high-level political forum, it was like, all governments turned up with their videos, their promotional videos, and they're just naked bids for investment. Bahrain was spectacular. Come to Bahrain, invest in Bahrain. This is supposed to be a record of what you've been doing to meet the SDGs, and it was just this promotional video. So it's very frustrating. Space for civil society engagement and interrogation of the official reports is very minimal. This is at the global level. But as you rightly say, it's really at the national level that change happens, and that it's the accountability mechanisms or the review mechanisms that are put in place by different states that will really make a difference. Some states, particularly in Latin America, I would say there's some good examples of countries taking the SDGs quite seriously, and the regional UN commissions are also playing a role, and CEPAL in Latin America has played a positive role. But there are other countries where the SDGs, and I think we're living in one right now, where the SDGs are really not high on the political agenda of the current administration. I mean, here there's been a lot of, I remember seeing, so much kind of, there's so much anti-UN kind of, who are these people coming to tell us what to do? I've heard it say that the SDGs are a recipe for socialism. Here, there's a lot of political forces that are vehemently anti-SDGs. So I'm not sure strategies for getting, for advancing the SDGs domestically, because they do apply. This is the other revolutionary thing. They're not just about development in developing countries. This is about, addressing poverty and inequality and other ills everywhere in every country. There is a vibrant movement, I think, nationally of civil society groups and academics to try and use the SDGs as a vehicle for change, particularly on access to justice issues, Goal 16. So I think at the civil society level, there's a lot happening around the SDGs in this country. At the governmental level, let's just say that Trump's tax reforms, so-called reforms, are not exactly aligned with human rights principles. I mean, massive redistribution of wealth upwards to the top is profoundly antithetical to the concepts of progressive realization, maximum available resources, and all those beautiful terms that I spouted before. So I don't know if that answers your question in terms of it's very, it depends. In each country there are the SDGs have different levels of traction. Like I say, some governments are taking them quite seriously. Wealthy governments generally have, they've always seen the development commitments as something, they're only relevant in terms of their development aid corporation. And the SDGs in a way have turned the tables and said, no, you have development commitments internally too. And so some wealthier governments are taking that responsibility more seriously than others. Hi.
You mentioned
Hello.
Hi.
You mentioned how post-industrial disenfranchised sort of inequalities in the United States and Europe have become a boom for right-wing populism. And there seems to, at least at a rhetorical level, be an enmity developed between the poor of more prosperous countries and the poor of less developed countries, in terms of you're in this situation because someone in this place took your job. So how do we reconcile the sort of emerging tension between within country inequalities in more economically prosperous countries and the among country inequalities that we're also trying to resolve? Because as of now, at least rhetorically, in the public discourse, they seem to be one another's greatest enemy, at least in a certain proposition.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, my mind goes to how at the international level, trade union federations are doing really interesting work around this. Because trade unions generally protect the workers within one country, that's where you could see these tensions playing out. We don't want our jobs to go there. And yet there are some kind of quite far-sighted, visionary voices and actors within international trade union organizing that are trying to break down that barrier precisely for the reasons that you say. Like, this isn't about enmity between, workers in poor countries and workers in rich countries. So that's how I would respond to that. That we need to at least being on guard about that risk is already a first step. And so I would go to what actors like ITUC, Public Services International, these global trade union federations are doing about this issue that you raise. But it's a very good point. Yeah. Any other comments, questions? And by the way, it's not just US and Europe. I mean, the two examples that I gave were, the second was Brazil, where, as you know, the next president might make ours look moderate and reasonable by comparison.
So in the report, when it comes to measuring progress in tackling inequality, it's suggested that affected communities should be closely involved in deciding the types of data that's required, and then also helping define their own discrimination. First off, are there examples of that happening in countries? And then also, how can uniformity sort of be ensured so that way it can be seen, looked at globally or on a bigger scale?
This was a huge debate when, in the context of what indicators to use to measure the Sustainable Development Goals and commitments. And it's sort of a bit of a human rights principle to say, what you have a say in what gets measured about your life, So, rather than somebody imposing on you, the metric of your well-being will be X. What about if I have a different concept of what my well-being should be? So that's why in our report we reference that important approach and principle. Of course, as your question implies, operationally that could lead to all sorts of issues, because how do you reconcile and how do you standardize so that you can measure big collectives of people in ways that are harmonizable? That's a big problem. But there are other examples. In the context of the consultations, there was a lot of consultation around Agenda 2030. It was perhaps an unprecedented level of civil society consultation. And that's why, there's a certain level of civil society ownership of the SDGs too, because people can trace things calls that came from civil society too. And so in the course of those consultations, there were in many countries, there were really quite meaningful consultations with communities about what should be measured. What does poverty mean to you? What aspect of being deprived impacts most on you? And the answers are sometimes surprising. They're sometimes to do just with feelings of shame or feelings of dignity rather than, material deprivation. So I think always asking, whenever there's some kind of global measurement, global metric initiative, always asking the subjects of rights what it is that they value. There's that, it's become a cliche now, but you measure what you treasure. That was used a lot in the debates around the SDGs. So it's important that the subjects of measurement have a say in what gets measured.
For Professor Lentz, if you have had your folks that you've worked with involved in metrics or measuring, how this has played out in your work.
Well, so I think it's challenging, right? And sometimes ideas that you might have are not the ideas that your subjects have or that your participants have as important. And I think part of this research where we were talking to women in rural Bangladesh about what their barriers to nutrition are, and some of them talking about how, they have to eat last, and that means they don't have the tastiest bits of food. The tastiest meaning oftentimes the most nutrient-dense foods are the ones that are eaten first. And so they may not go to bed hungry, but they're often eating a diet of rice, right? And so as we were talking to them, well, what are the things that matter to you? Well, many women were like, well, yeah, we know we're going to bed hungry, but we're also not spending as much as we could on food because we really want our kids to go to school, right? And so they are kind of they're absorbing the lack of adequate kind of economic resources in their family, and they're making a trade-off to do so, right? And so this is like the measure what you treasure. Well, it's also like I come in as someone who works on food insecurity. I'm like, of course, being hungry and not getting enough food and not having good food is what matters. But that's totally my perception. A lot of the women that we work with are much more interested in trying to shore up their children's futures and are doing so to their own well-being, the detriment of their own well-being. And so I think in that sense, like a lot of the conversations that we've had have sort of tried to reframe what are the things that people are prioritizing and how do we help them achieve what they want what they're looking for, right? And I still ultimately think like no one should be going to bed hungry or not eating enough food. But for people who are in really constrained circumstances, they might very well choose to make that a second, third, or even fourth priority. Does that kind of get it? Yeah.
People had many more questions last week. But I do have a question or two. And I have first an observation and then a question. And if you want to say something about the observation, then so much the better. So it seems like it's relatively easier to focus on the sort of what I would call the mid-level inequalities. So within country inequalities across, vertical inequalities within a country. Those are things that we're more or less comfortable talking about. We can address with redistributive policies of different sorts that are, I think, relatively accessible to us. Then we have the sort of moving up a level, the cross-country inequalities that seem really challenging. There have been at different times, especially, well, since the UN was started or since the end of World War II, calls to reduce, especially to redress the effects of colonialism and natural resource extraction and movement of resources from the global south to the global north, and ways to sort of redress that. But they're all, I don't know if this is right, but I'm just going to say it anyway. They all seem to have generally failed, right? They end up in nothing. And then we have, if you move down a level, you have these really, something I hadn't actually really thought of before, Erin mentioned it, with these within household inequalities, which from a policy perspective seem like incredibly intractable, right? And so that one, it seemed, right, that as you mentioned in relationship to labor rights, right, what labor rights can do for inequality is empower people to negotiate for a rightful share without actually maybe directly targeting that rightful share, right? And what that rightful share is, or trying to define it, or trying to reallocate, or to move it from one person to another. And it seems like maybe you could do something similar with household inequalities, right? Which is to use human rights to target, to give people the tools within their own households to begin to challenge some of those inequities in their own domestic context. And I don't know if you've done anything on that or if you have any comments on that. The question that I had is actually a little bit more concrete, and that is, has anyone successfully or otherwise tried to put some real substance on this question of the maximum available resources? Like, what's available? What is the maximum that's available? Has anybody actually tried to challenge the allocation of spending across really different subject areas? Like, how much should you spend on bridges if you have people going hungry? How much should you spend on the military if you have really terrible public schools? How much, those sorts of things, because it seems like the answer very often to claims for more education, more healthcare, whatever, is our budget for education is already all allocated, or our budget for healthcare is already spent, and not a question of how much do you allocate to education versus very different things. And I just wondered if anybody had used sort of the human rights machinery or human rights language to challenge that allocation of resources across subject areas.
Yeah, there's quite a lot of, it's a very effervescent area of work, maximum available resources. We ourselves right now are engaged in some work in a project with de Justicia in Colombia with the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and particularly with two members, Rodrigo Uprimni, who also is the connection to De Justicia, and Olivier de Schutter, precisely because there's appetite now on the committee to really interrogate the question of maximum available resources. So there's been a few kind of workshops and resources on maximum available resources that are being prepared, and they're we're at a very early stage where we're just getting the questions that committee members have in their mind. You know, like what are the issues that this principle poses for you? And yes, the question of trade-offs. You know, to what extent can a treaty monitoring body engage in questioning trade-offs? The committee does, and usually it's the cliched, you know, why so much on military spending and not on, but they rarely interrogate trade-offs between, say, health and education, or, you know, two worthy-sounding competing goals. The issues around MAR are often, there's been too much of a focus on interrogating spending of existing resources and less on revenue generation. So I'm talking here about the committee and treaty bodies generally are less good at interrogating how revenue is generated, and they limit the MAR questioning to questions of expenditure. So we and others are trying to get them to interrogate how, because it's really questioning the size of the pie. You know, because most states say, well, we only have this, and interrogating tax policy means, well, maybe you could have this if you know, increased your corporate tax rates, or if you clamped down on tax evasion, or, you know, reduce tax incentives. So those are the kinds of issues right now that are being interrogated around maximum available resources. But yeah, maybe that's something we should collaborate on.
Can I do a follow-up on that?
Of course.
So a couple of things come to mind. One is this question of sort of tax giveaways to corporations that settle in different communities is something that's come up actually recently in Texas as well. And there's one of my colleagues has actually done some interesting work on showing that, you know, the communities often benefit so little. The hope is that the jobs will be the main benefit, but then, you know, education and then health and all the other things just kind of fall by the wayside. I was just thinking, sort of the impulse, I guess this is a US question, but maybe think about that too. I mean, the impulse in the US has been so much to cut taxes in the hope of producing economic development, that it seems to me that in particular public education has suffered a lot in the US at different state levels and in different states. And have you done any work in the US to try to sort of challenge that maybe that obsession with cutting taxes and cutting taxes?
So one of the most recent thing we have done in the US is precisely on the tax cuts at the end of last year, talking about how they were regressive and therefore in breach of human rights principles. Even if this administration doesn't believe it has those obligations, we still cite them. And also talking, because we're an international organization, talking about their possible impacts abroad, in the sense, the copycat kind of, you know, on taxation, there's a global race to the bottom. So, you know, one country cuts taxes and cuts corporate taxes, other countries want to do the same so that they're not missing out. So it's the opposite of international tax cooperation, which, by the way, in answer to your first, or in response to your first observation on how the human rights community can address sort of between country inequalities, and being such a mammoth issue and all these failed endeavors that there have been in the past, I think this issue, international tax cooperation, is a really promising front of struggle for the human rights community, because it's tangible, the impact, the ways in which one country's tax policy, or, you know, Switzerland being a tax haven, for example, how that impacts on human rights abroad can be tracked. I mean, it's complex, but it can be, and you know, it has huge implications in terms of the resources that are being denied the public coffers as a result of tax abuse and tax dodging. So that's why I would say that that's one of the key priorities and key entry points, I think, for the human rights movement those that want to engage with this kind of issue, but in addressing those cross-country inequalities, because it's probably up there and the single most important factor fueling those inequalities between countries. I've forgotten your question about the U.S. What's that?
Have you looked at sort of at the state level at states that are sort of starving themselves of
Right.
resources like Wisconsin and some
Right.
others?
Actually, no. I mean, we do very selective work in the U.S. Usually, developments in the U.S. that have global implications. So the Trump tax cuts really were, I mean, they were so out there, and they have these global implications that I mentioned that we addressed it. But we sort of have a division of labor with national organizations like the one I mentioned before, the National Economic and Social Rights Initiative, NESRI, we mentioned when we were talking earlier, who do this kind of work, but we haven't. Wasn't there a question related to you as well, Dan? No? One of Dan's questions?
There's another question over here.
Job team. All right, great.
Otherwise, we'll have to get the microphone back.
So I was very heartened by your Spain example. I think it's one of the more uplifting things that we've heard so far in all
It's a good
of
news story.
all of
Yeah.
the talks here. But I was very struck by how the outcome at the end, and then your work being cited, that was all sort of as the result of a political moment. There was an
Yeah,
election,
exactly.
and it
Exactly.
switched parties. And I'm curious, in your work, how much is sort of waiting for that political opportunity? Because, like you said, there was a government that was completely non-responsive to it. So were you just, I guess, ready to spring into action when it changed? And how do you think about that in the various places that you do work on?
Yeah. So the Spain victory, and I think it is a victory, has prompted us to think a lot about this and how, here you rub up against a kind of traditional principle of human rights organizations, particularly international ones, about not getting too close to political forces, to maintain your, appearance of independence. Well, to maintain your independence and your appearance of independence, both things. But I think if we really want to effect change, we have to be smart and strategic about capitalizing on opportunities. And I think there's a way of doing that without compromising on your independence. But, it's just fact that there are political forces that are more amenable to human rights arguments than others. And there are, we're hearing day after day of, lurches to towards authoritarianism. But for every 2 lurches towards authoritarianism, there's a good news story somewhere else. And for human rights, in terms of leadership that might be more open to human rights arguments. Mexico's a case in point, and and I think once the government takes office there, Mexico, both domestically and internationally, might be amenable to some of these ESCR kind of agendas and arguments. So I think it's a question of just being poised for action, looking out for, having a good feel for where potential change might come, but also maintaining a healthy distance so that you're not compromising you're not seen as politically partisan.
Is this on? A follow-up question on that, maybe to make it a little bit more specific. You look at the case of Puerto Rico right now, and you look at austerity measures, and you look, I was just talking to you about Naomi Klein, just recently wrote a thing about sort of applying the shock doctrine to Puerto Rico. Is Puerto Rico a lost cause because of the Trump presidency, or is it, you look at either shock doctrine or like the book Why Nations Fail, Darren Acemoglu talks about like critical junctures, right? So is this a moment that you need to grab onto because more attention is being paid to Puerto Rico after Maria, or is it a lost cause, a give up, because there's no political will in the United States at the moment?
I mean, I'm not very well placed to comment because, you know, I don't claim to be an expert on Puerto Rico or even, you know, on what this political moment represents. But I do think that just as an informed citizen, I feel that post-Maria, it brought such, you know, it brought into such stark relief Puerto Rico's, the implications of Puerto Rico's neo-colonial status or colonial status. I mean, it really is not, and the unfairness of that and how the U.S. tries to have it both ways, you know, like by sort of absolving itself of any real accountability or responsibility and at the same time still maintaining its territorial hold. So I would have thought, my non-expert opinion on Puerto Rico is that this would be a good moment to, I mean, despite the lack of political traction in the administration, that at least there's other forces whose awareness has been engaged as a result of Maria, I would say. And that could be a moment to capitalize on it. But that's as far as I would go. I can't get more specific. Hi.
Coming. I am wondering, I'll take us to a very basic question. What dignity means to you and how you're using it? Does it mean equality? Or, I mean, what specific? I know what it means to me, but, and in education specifically, and it's more of a person-to-person relation, but yeah, can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. Dignity is an interesting concept. It's kind of seen in human rights, the human rights lexicon, as this kind of concept, like a source from which human rights sprang. And I think the only reference to it is in the preamble of the Universal Declaration. You know, all human beings are equal and free and equal in dignity and rights. So, and I find that it's often used by people who don't want to talk about rights, but kind of that's okay. You know, people who, in contexts perhaps where human rights has such baggage and such connotations, that they find dignity speaks to people more meaningfully. And I've encountered many people, particularly I would say from social movements, who prefer talking about, it's code for them in a way. They talk about dignity as a more meaningful way of talking about human rights. That human rights sounds a little technical, technocratic, conjures up images of courts, or, you know, it resonates with different connotations for different people. But I think dignity as a source concept for what human rights means. What is the goal of human rights, if not to protect and fulfill human dignity? You know, I see dignity as this kind of more meta concept that human rights relates to. What does it mean to you?
It means recognizing another person's humanity, their value as a whole being.
Yeah.
Empathy.
Yeah, I think it embodies or encases the idea of common humanity and and universality and a deep sense of equality. You know, that by virtue of being human, we all have dignity, where it's something inalienable that can't be taken away from you. Yeah.
So then how does that get measured? Is it just based on opinion polls, or like what's the metric for dignity?
I'd love to know what you're studying. Law, okay. With a few stats on the sideline, or, you know, data. No, I mean metrics of dignity. I mean, it depends on the dimensions of dignity that you're trying to measure. I am not aware of any metrics of dignity, of any initiative anywhere where they've tried to measure what dignity. No?
I mean, there's like things like if people are trying to get at maybe like Amartya Sen style capabilities
Yeah.
index, which is
Yeah.
not the same, but
But something like a human development index that's more attuned to holistic views
Mm-hmm.
of people.
but there would have to presumably be some kind of
Yeah.
element of self-perception
Yeah.
in that,
Yeah.
I guess.
I mean, I don't know of any kind of, globally comparable data sets that try to measure dignity. Like none of the ones that use kind of mix and DHS data, the measures that go into the Human Development Index or the multidimensional poverty index or any of these. I don't know of any that try to have a metric for dignity. Maybe you do. No?
I have a follow-up question to something you said earlier, talking about independence and political movements. This, by the way, is kind of the policy table. I was wondering, to what extent do you think human rights and human rights advocacy can be bipartisan or multipartisan, especially in this age when it feels like we're moving very much to the extremes on both sides?
Yeah. It's a question that keeps me awake a bit at night, and I think, how can we, I was schooled in human rights at Amnesty, and Amnesty, has this, it was drummed into us every day, independence. And of course, it's an impossible position. Independence doesn't exist, but that's why I mentioned before the perception of independence. And I do think that there are situations where the polarity is so extreme, that there's one party that is antithetical to human rights and everything the human rights movement stands for, and another that is less so. I'm not saying that that's the case here, but in many situations it is that stark and that polarized, and how the human rights community accommodates to that reality, I think. It does call into question whether this, whether at some point an excessive neutrality becomes partisan. So I think that's the balance that you need to engage with. So maybe there are situations where I like the way you framed it as multi-partisan. But generally, being perceived as partisan can really, just even for tactical reasons, can really sink your cause. So for an organization like ours, it's really important that we maintain that protection and not be accused of partisanship.
So, I mean, this is an interesting question. I mean, I think there in Argentina, where I've spent more time, there are groups that maybe got too close to the prior government and lost a lot of credibility with other interlocutors. At the same time, Amnesty's strong position on being apolitical and nonpartisan seems also problematic at times. So I mean, it seems necessary to take a political position. But anyway, that's another conversation. And thank you so much for your presentation. And
Thank you.